Hello, welcome back everybody. This is the next video in the history of the Chrysler V8 engine, or AKA the next Mopar video. So in earlier videos we talked about the Hemi, the hemispherical design engine, and we touched on the polyspherical engine that was closely related to the Hemi. In this video, we're going to talk about the other big blocks and the small blocks that Chrysler made. The first engine series was a big block that was closely related to the Hemi, but it was a different engine and it definitely had a much different cylinder head, and that would be the B series engines. In 1958, Chrysler designed a B-series engine, and one of the drawbacks to the Hemi is that it was very heavy. So the Chrysler engineers had redesigned some of the new body styles of the cars, and they had what they called the cab forward styling. They actually moved the center of gravity and the design of the body forward, closer to the front of the vehicle, with a shorter hood. One of the issues they ran into with the Hemi, because of its weight, was that the weight distribution from the front to the back of the car with the new body style, the new body design, was not good. The Hemi there was actually too much weight up front, and they found themselves having to add a bunch of weight to the back of the car to even that out. Well, the engineers, most of the engineers at the time, the consensus was they didn't want to add weight to the car, because then you hurt fuel mileage, you hurt the power to weight ratio and so forth. So what they decided to do is they decided to produce another line of engines that was lighter, but they wanted something that would produce power and just as much reliability as the Hemi, and also was less expensive to produce. One of the issues with the hemispherical engines, or as they called them in the early days, the dual rocker shaft engine, was that they were expensive to produce. It took a lot longer to produce the engine, and it cost more money. And along with the aspect of the different styling of the cab of the vehicle moved forward in the car, Chrysler was looking for an opportunity to build a less expensive alternative to the Hemi, because the Hemi was elaborate and expensive. So they wanted something lighter, cheaper to produce, and that would produce really good power that was comparable to the Hemis or even better. So because of this, the engineers came up with a new design engine, which is known as the B series engine. Now, the B series engine is a big block, and it was produced starting in 1958. Chrysler produced a 350 cubic inch big block engine that was actually designed to replace the firepower Hemi that Chrysler had up until that point. The block of the B engine was very different from the Hemi block, and also the heads were very different. It was a wedge type combustion chamber with a single rocker shaft. It was a very robust and beefy block. It was a skirted block, much like the 426 Hemi. In fact, the 426 Hemi block was very similar to the B block and the RB block, with a few exceptions. However, it was different, but they are similar in design. Chrysler stuck with the B and RB design even with the Hemi engine. In fact, the Hemi engine could be considered an RB block, although they didn't designate it that way. It was in its own category as the 426 Hemi. Now, all of the B series big block engines had the same crankshaft and the same stroke, but the bore sizes varied quite a bit from the start to the finish of the series. The bore size of the 350 B engine Now, what's interesting about Chrysler bore and stroke sizes, I actually didn't know this until I started really getting into building these engines about 10-15 years ago, and that is all of the bore sizes, almost all of the bore sizes in the Chrysler, Dodge, DeSoto, Chrysler Corporation, Mopar engines was based on fractional sizes. In other words, the bore size of the 350 is 4.062. So you'll notice that a lot of the Chrysler engines followed that theme. They made their bore and strokes to match up to fractional sizes. In other words, their bore size isn't 60 over, 4.060, like a lot of manufacturers will do. It is 62 thousandths over. So I thought that's an interesting thing, and that's why you see kind of, when you go to decimals with a lot of these bore sizes, you see these oddball bores. It's not 60 over, it's 62 over. Or they'll do 3/16, or they'll do 5/8. Now, some of the bore and stroke sizes were 3.625, which is 3 5/8 of an inch. That's just one of the interesting things that the Chrysler engineers when they designed a lot of their engines. Now, they also produced an engine the following year in 1959 that had a cubic inch of 361. Now, here's the thing. The 361 is exactly the same engine as the 350B engine. The only difference is they bored the cylinders out larger. They went from 4.062 to 4.125. Coincidentally, 0.125, which was 4 1/8 of an inch. Other than that, it was the same engine, and of course a stroke of 3.375. The 350 and 361 engines were rated on the low end with a 2-barrel carburetor at 295 horsepower. They did not publish the torque. And they also had a dual 4-barrel version of the 361 that made 320 horsepower and was produced in some of the heavier cars. The Plymouth version was called the Commando, and they also had the Super Commando with the 4 barrels on it. The DeSoto version of the 350 361 was called the Turbo Flash. And in the Chrysler, they called it the Super Red Ram, not to be confused with the Super Red Ram Hemi. They just used the same name, but it was a very different engine. It was a B-series engine. Now, in the later years, they did try the same fuel injection, the electronic fuel injection that they used on one of the Hemis, but it was a dismal failure, just like it was in the earlier days. It didn't fly. Most of those were removed and replaced with carburetors by the dealership. Now, in 1959, they also introduced a 383 cubic inch B-series motor. Now, you got to be careful that you don't get confused here, because there was a B-series 383, and later when we get to the RB series. Now, RB is simply a B engine with a raised deck. The R stands for raised. So they did make a version of the B engine, as we'll see later, with a taller deck, and they called it the RB series, and it was a similar engine, although it was a taller block. So the 383B was a low deck 383, just like the 350 361. We'll get to the RB, the raised deck 383, later as we progress through this. The 383 was similar in just about every way to the 350 and 361. They shared the same crankshaft. The difference was the bore size. The 383 had the same crank, the same rods, but a larger bore and a different piston that was larger. They went from a 4 1/8 inch bore to a 4 1/4 inch bore. So they went from 4.125 to 4.250 on the bore size, and of course they retained the crank stroke, which gave us 383 cubic inches. The 383B engine was considered Chrysler's performance version of the B. It was produced in several versions. One of them had a cross-ram intake manifold with dual Carter carburetors, a dual point distributor, and high flow exhaust that produced 330 horsepower and 460 foot-pounds of torque. So it was definitely a torque monster. And actually, those torque numbers that 383 produced was the highest torque of any V8 Chrysler engine to that date, even higher than the earlier Hemis. Definitely something that you would feel when you hit the throttle. So this was a real performance engine that they had produced here. It was a big bore short stroke motor, so it revved really well. It had really good breathing cylinder heads and big valves and a free flowing exhaust. So it was the 383B engine was a real screamer in its day. The next engine that we have to talk about is a very special engine. It wasn't produced until 1972, but it is a B block. It is the lower deck B version, and it actually shares the crankshaft with all the engines we just talked about. This was a 400 cubic inch engine, probably one of the most underrated big block engines that Chrysler ever made. The 400 had its run from 1972 to 78. Now, This engine was actually the strongest big block that Chrysler ever made. The block was the strongest, beefiest block. It was actually stronger than the 426 Hemi. So it was a really, really stout, heavy-duty block that makes a fantastic hot rod engine. Another attribute of the 400 that was really amazing was the bore size. Huge bore. It retained the same crank stroke as the earlier ones, but it has this huge bore, so it was a big bore short stroke motor. Now, one of the things that really high-end drag race engine designers do is they always try to make a very short stroke, big bore engine. These engines seem to make the most high RPM power, so that big bore gives a lot more volume for more air and fuel, and a shorter stroke allows the engine to rev very high. So the 400 with the short stroke and the giant bore has the makings of a really powerful, nasty hot rod, street rod, or drag race engine. And the block is actually the strongest, beefiest big block that Chrysler ever came out with. So if you ever have the opportunity to pick up a 400 big block Chrysler engine that was produced from 72 to 78, snatch that thing up, because you've got the makings of just an absolute monster of an engine there. Now, here's the thing. The 400 kind of got a bad reputation because from the factory, it was very low compression. It had a dinky camshaft in it. It had really terrible cam timing that was just not optimal for performance. And the reason that it did was because there was so many emissions, EPA regulations, fuel mileage regulations, things of that nature that had come on the scene in 1972-73 when that engine was produced. And so because of all of the restrictions, this engine was detuned. The 400 was just built in a manner to meet the regulations, and it just did not produce a lot of power. The two-barrel version of the 400 had 175 horsepower. The highest version of it had 260 horsepower in the earlier days and 410 foot-pounds of torque, which was okay. And that was with a 4-barrel and high-flow exhaust. That was a very low compression engine. It was just right above 7.8, 7.9 to 1. Had all of the terrible components installed on it, like I said earlier. My experience with the 400 is this. If you take the engine and you build it in hot rod trim or high performance trim, it is absolutely one of the best performing big blocks that Chrysler ever produced, or at least it has the potential to be because of the big bore short stroke. I did one for a customer about 10 years ago, and we were expecting 475 to 500 horsepower on the dyno. We were stunned at the power numbers that this thing made and the ability of it to rev pretty high. That engine at about 6,800 RPMs made over 600 horsepower, and it wasn't really that radical of a build. It was still actually a pump gas engine, but we just put really, really good heads and induction system and exhaust on it and bumped the compression up and got the timing and the cam optimized. And that thing is a real winner. So again, I can't stress enough how much potential that 400B engine has. That thing is a real gem if you find one. And that was basically the last version of the B motor that they made. By 1978, all of the big blocks pretty much went out of production. Now, the RB block was made at the same time in conjunction with the B blocks. In 1959, they also produced what they called the RB block, or the raised B. Now, the B engine had a deck height. Deck height is the distance from the center of the crank bore to the deck of the block. It had a deck height of 9.980. The RB engine, or the raised B, had a deck height of 10 inches, 725 thousandths. What this did is this made the deck height of the RB, or the raised B, 3/4 of an inch, or 750 thousandths taller than the B engine. And they did this because they wanted a larger engine for bigger cubic inch capability. And they wanted something that had a longer stroke capability for some of their truck applications to produce more torque. So in 1959, the RB383 was produced. Now again, do not confuse the RB383 with the B383. They are not the same engine. The only thing that's the same about them is the cubic inches. Chrysler bumped the stroke of the RB version of the big block from 3.375 in the B engines to 3 inches, 750 thousandths. So they added a significant amount of stroke to the crankshaft. So it's 3 3/4 inch stroke instead of 3 3/8 inch. RB383 had a bore of 4.031, and of course the stroke was 3.750. This was a tall deck block that produced actually pretty decent horsepower and torque. The 383 RB, when it came out, produced about 315 horsepower and 375 foot-pounds of torque. The following year, they increased the bore size to 4.187, which brought the cubic inches up to 413. Now the 413 was actually one of the more sought after engines, and they actually did make high performance versions of it in the 300E in 1959 and 1960. The single 4-barrel version of the 413 made 340 horsepower and 480 foot-pounds of torque. There was a version of it with a cross ram, dual Carter carburetor, manifold, high flow exhaust, dual pointed distributor that produced 390 horsepower and a whopping 530 foot-pounds of torque, which was actually a record up to that date. Now the next RB engine in line was one that has become legendary in the annals of Chrysler history, and that was the 426 wedge. Now the 426 wedge should not be confused with the 426 Hemi. It is not the same engine. The blocks are similar, but it had the wedge type single rocker shaft big block heads, and there were some differences between the Hemi block and the 426 wedge block. They took the bore of the RB engine to 4.250, and of course 3 3/4 inch stroke, which gave us 426 cubic inches. The wedge was available in 4 or 5 different versions. There was a mild single carb version that produced 375 horsepower. That was an 11-to-1 compression engine. They bumped the compression of that same configuration with a single carb up to 12-to-1, and it made 385 horsepower. Doesn't seem like a big gain, but it is what it is. With dual carbs, it was 413 horsepower with 11-to-1 compression and 425 horsepower with 12-to-1 compression. They also had another race version called the Max Wedge. It had high flow heads with very large valves, dual carbs with a cross ram intake, high flow dual exhaust with high flow special manifolds, dual point distributor. The valves in the heads that were on the Max Wedge were so big that the cylinder block, the cylinder itself and the engine actually had to be notched to clearance the valves. It also had a much more radical solid lifter cam in it. The 426 Max Wedge was rated from Chrysler at the factory at 425 horsepower, but independent dyno tests have confirmed and verified with multiple tests that that engine was well north of 485 horsepower, and the torque was in the 550 to 560 range. So this was a very, very potent factory hot rod / race engine that was optional. They wanted to use it in NASCAR and some other race series, so they actually produced it for sale. So the Max, really, when it comes to the RB engines in that era, the 426 Max Wedge is the one you wanted. That was the powerhouse. Now, the next engine up from that was, of course, an engine that is very legendary when it comes to big block Chryslers. Everybody knows about this engine, and that is the RB version of the 440. 440 cubic inches, probably one of the most mass-produced, one of the highest numbers of mass-produced RB engines ever. They made millions and millions of these things with a bunch of different versions. The horsepower potential of the 440 is incredibly good. It is not uncommon to see high performance build versions of the 440 making north of 750 to 800 horsepower. The 440 had a huge 4.320 bore and a 3.750 stroke. Again, They stuck with the shorter stroke and made the bore much larger. Big bore, short stroke motors are really the ticket to creating a lot of horsepower potential. The single 4-barrel version from the factory had 375 horsepower and 480 foot-pounds of torque, and that was basically just your plain Jane 440. They also made a 6-pack version, which was the 440 6-pack that was rated at 390 horsepower and 490 foot-pounds of torque. But again, this is another situation where Chrysler was underrating this engine. Independent dyno tests have confirmed that this engine, with a little bit of tuning, was making north of 430, 440 horsepower, 1 horsepower per cubic inch. With the cam swap and a few cylinder head mods, the 440 is well north of 500 horsepower and very near 600 foot-pounds of torque. It was known as the Magnum engine in the Dodges, the 440 Magnum, and the Super Commando in the Plymouths, but it was basically the same engine. Now, in the later years, just like the 400, the 440 was just an empty shell of its former self because the compression absolutely went into the toilet. The heads were restrictive. The emissions just choked it out. The last year the 440 was made, it produced a measly 255 horsepower. However, all of the things that were put onto that 440 that choked it out could be removed, and you could modify that engine with good heads, good cam, optimize the induction and exhaust system, and you've easily got well north of a 500 horsepower street engine. So the 440, regardless of what version it was, is a fantastic engine. They did use these in a lot of motorhomes. There's a lot of motorhomes that you can pick up really cheap. You get a 440 motorhome engine. Some guys will slap them in a car and just go, but they only had 250 to 260 horsepower. They did have really good torque. But the motorhome engines, again, is the same beefy 440 skirted block as any of the rest of them and can be modified to make really big horsepower and torque. It's a fantastic engine with a lot of potential. So pretty much any year 440 is good. Even if it's one of the later years, you can get that engine and modify it, and you got yourself a real screamer. And that pretty much rounds out the B and the RB engines. Now we're going to shift gears, and a lot of the other videos I've done, we started with the small blocks. We go away from the big block Chrysler engines and we shift gears to their small block. Chrysler wanted a smaller, lighter engine that they could use for some of the lower line of cars, so they produced what they call the A-series engine. Now the A-series engine was also known as the polyspherical or the poly-headed engine. Not to be confused with the Chrysler and DeSoto polyspherical engines, which were actually the early Hemi engines with a different cylinder head, a single rocker shaft cylinder head. The A engines were completely different. They were not using the Hemi block. They had their own block, which was designated as a small block by Chrysler, and it used the single rocker shaft polyspherical head. Now the thing about the polyspherical engine is it had canted valve heads, which is actually a really good design. The polyspherical heads, in my opinion, Chrysler should have stuck with it rather than going to the LA engine, which was a wedge head. Because the polyspherical, even though the heads were not developed as well as they could be, the canted valve head design, or the valves that are laid over and opposed, they also called it a semi-Hemi. Polyspherical means double or dual spheres, so it had valves that were opposed on either side. This is actually creates cross-flow in my opinion, is a much better valve configuration design. A lot of manufacturers use these for performance motors. This was the valve configuration of the Hemi. The 351 Cleveland use this design. The 385 big block Fords use this design. The big block Chevy used this design. These were all touted as performance type valve trains. Rather than having a wedge type head that had parallel valves or valves that were in a straight line, which actually is not as good for airflow potential. But unfortunately, Chrysler did not develop the polyspherical engine. They kind of went away from the design, so that the head really never got an opportunity to see full potential. In my opinion, I believe if they had developed the polyspherical head, it would have actually outperformed the later wedge type parallel valve head that they used on all the later small blocks. But it is what it is. Unfortunately, because there's not a lot of aftermarket support for the polyspherical heads, because Chrysler went away from the design, building one of those engines nowadays is a very expensive endeavor, and it is also very difficult to find parts for them. So as we'll see here in a little bit, everything shifted to the LA version. So when Chrysler decided that the Plymouth needed a different engine, they wanted a lower cost engine for their Plymouth line. None of the Plymouths got Hemis. And so they went to the polyspherical type engine that we're talking about. And starting in 1955, they produced a 277 cubic inch polyspherical engine for their Plymouth line. Not a real powerhouse of an engine. It had 187 horsepower with a 2-barrel carburetor. They did have a 4-barrel version of that engine that made 200 horsepower, and it had a performance package with dual exhaust. They called it the Power Pack engine. It's just an upgraded version of the same engine that was optional if you wanted a little more power. The 277 had a 3 3/4 inch bore, 3.750, and a stroke of 3.125. So small bore and stroke engine, but it was the polyspherical configuration. The following year they produced the 301 cubic inch engine, which had a 3.906 bore, and it shared the stroke with the 277 and was rated at 220 horsepower. The next version was the 303 cubic inch engine, not to be confused with the 303 Hemi or the 303 Hemi / polyspherical engine that was in the Chryslers. This was a completely different engine. It shared the cubic inch with the 303 Chrysler, but nothing else. The 303 with a 4-barrel carburetor was rated at 240 horsepower and was available in several of the Plymouth vehicles. Now they also had a 313 version of the polyspherical engine, but it was never sold in North America. It was for some Canadian and South American vehicles that were sold outside the United States, so it wasn't really something that you would find in America. Now, like I said, these engines were not very sought after. They didn't make a large number of them, and they only made them for a few years. Finding any of these engines nowadays is near impossible. They did have another version of the polyspherical that was the 318, which you will see some of these around. They call it the 318 poly head, the 318 wide block, the 318 polyspherical. This is an A engine with a single rocker arm cylinder head and the canted valve polyspherical head. The 318 version of the polyspherical engine had a 3-inch 906 bore and a 3.312 stroke. Not to be confused with the LA version of the 318, which was produced when the 318 poly was phased out. In 1964, the LA version, or the light A version of the small blocks, which is the small block configuration that we know that ran all the way through the 70s, 80s, and 90s. The first LA engine that was produced was 273 cubic inches for the 1964 model year. The 273 was produced from 64 to 69, and it had 180 horsepower with a 2-barrel carburetor. They also did make a performance engine, performance version of the 273 that had 275 horsepower in the Dart D and the Barracudas. The 273 did have a performance version that they called the Formula S, and it came out between 65 and 67 in the Barracudas. It had a 4-barrel carburetor, 10-to-1 compression, free-flowing exhaust, and dual-point distributor with a high-lift solid lifter cam. It was also in the D version of the Dodge Dart. It produced 275 horsepower and 310 foot-pounds of torque. Not bad for 273 cubic inches. It was 1 horsepower per cubic inch. The 273 was produced from 1964 to 69. In 69, the LA engine was produced, and the polyspherical engines basically disappeared. They went out of production, and they started producing what they called the LA version of the small block. LA simply means light A. They lightened up, they made a much smaller, lighter cylinder head. That was a wedge type head with parallel valves that were in line. They got rid of the cross-flow heads. They got rid of the canted valve head, which, like I said, I think was a mistake. But the LA version of this engine has actually quite a bit of potential. The nice thing about the LA version is there are a lot of parts available and a lot of aftermarket support for it. So it can be built into a pretty significant street rod motor. The LA version of the 318 was produced from 1968 through 91. In 92, they went to a newer version of the engine called the Magnum. We'll talk about that later. The bore and the stroke was 3.906 and 3.312. It had a couple of different versions. The police version had a quadrajet carburetor, and the standard passenger car truck version had what they call a thermal quad carburetor. The center of the carburetor was plastic. If you get a chance sometime, Google thermal quad. It's a very interesting carburetor. Like David Freiberger always says, thermal quad is the only carburetor that punishes you for going wide open throttle. In 1985, the 318 got a roller cam and fuel injection. So there was a roller cam version of the block, which actually makes pretty good upgrade and something that you can take and build a carbureted V8 with and make a decent street rod. The 318 horsepower numbers were very unimpressive. It had about 185 horsepower and 230 foot-pounds of torque. The next version of the LA engine was a factory hot rod engine. It was what's known as the 340 cubic inch motor. Now the 340 was designed to be a high performance engine. It had a forged crank, hammer forged rods, very stout cast aluminum pistons that were made thicker and heavier than the stock type pistons for more punishment. Full floating piston pins, which was very unusual for one of these small blocks. It had a high lift cam. Some versions even had a solid lifter cam, double roller timing chain, and a windage tray. The engine boasted 275 horsepower with a 4-barrel. They also had a 6-pack version that they claimed was 290 horsepower, but again, dyno tests have put that thing north of 350 horsepower. Very potent small block engine. Dual point distributor, high flow exhaust. The EPA killed this motor. In the early 70s, the 340 went away, mainly because it just was pointless to make an engine and choke it out with all the emission stuff. So it disappeared. It was replaced the following year by the 360 cubic inch LA engine, the 5.9 liter. The 360 has lots of potential. It had a bore of 4 inches and a stroke of 3.580 and was definitely one of the best LA performers as far as being able to modify it. Aftermarket heads, aftermarket intake. The thing is, the factory version of the LA 360 was very unimpressive just because, like we keep saying, in the 70s, the government regulations just choked these engines out. Chrysler did what they called a lean burn. They actually put an electronics on these engines that was called the lean burn computer, and it absolutely destroyed and decimated the performance of that engine to the point where dealerships were taking that off. Yeah, do a little research on the Chrysler lean burn electronics, and the best thing to do is throw that stuff in the trash because it really did hurt the performance of the engine. It was designed to help emissions and fuel economy, but it just absolutely decimated the power output of these engines. Even though they had a good bore and stroke combination and a lot of potential from the factory, they were pretty pathetic, to be honest. The highest horsepower version had 245 horsepower, and in the later years, with all of the emissions restrictions on them, they made about 185 horsepower. So you've got 360 cubic inches making 185 horsepower. That's pretty pathetic. The police version had H-beam rods, steel crank, and a better camshaft, and it made 255 horsepower. 82 through 89, the engine was available with a factory roller cam. Again, a very good block to build and modify. It did have a throttle body on it that was pretty terrible as far as its performance capabilities. It was very common to modify that engine by putting an aftermarket 4-barrel intake on it, a bigger camshaft, and better heads. And then you could get it to run pretty good. The next version, that engine lasted until 1989 and 2001. Chrysler came out with the Magnum series 5.2 318 and a 5.9 360 version, and we'll get into those next. They are very different engines from the LA. They are similar in cubic inch size, but they are not the same engines. They are similar dimensionally in size. They are similar in design and cubic inch wise, but they are definitely not the same engines.